Hey everyone, Pastor George here with today's Wednesday Bible study recap, and today we talked about Job chapters 34 and 35. And in these chapters we see a continuance of Elihu's previous arguing with Job and with Job's other three friends about how they've misunderstood God's work in the world. So Elihu's big contention in verse 30 in chapter 34 is to point out the difference between Job and God first, right? To highlight this idea that humans are created, and then to show how God is a good judge. And I found this really interesting because it's very challenging, I think, for a lot of us to hear what Elihu has to say, especially because Elihu, again, is presented as by the author of Job and himself as the one who has the correct interpretation of events, right? He isn't called out by God at the end, unlike Job's three other friends. So he understands where Job and his three friends misunderstand. And because of that, it means that Elihu's words, I think, are a little bit more complicated for us. And what I mean by that is he says things that we usually don't think about. So, for instance, just like everyone else in Job and his other three friends, everyone accepts that God punishes people on earth with things that happen. And I think that that's already something that's very difficult for us to grapple with and wrestle with, because that is just not in the West and in the United States, that is just not a picture of God that we like. And by we, I mean our culture. I'm not saying individuals, right? Now, when it comes to the difference there, that's because the Bible really, it really functions a lot that God is just and that God does punish people, right? He does bring people low in order to humble them and to get them to turn away from sin, right? That's something, and that's not something that Christians really ever shied away from until really recently. I blame the 60s, but what else can you do? And probably even before that. Let's just blame the whole 20th century. And so there's that, right? And I think that Elihu talks about that a lot here, and he talks about how God's judgments are just, and that we do not understand the mind of God in the way that we would like. And oftentimes it may appear that God is hidden, but we have to trust that he is working even behind the scenes. And this is something that Job doesn't trust in, right? This is how he calls out Job, is he basically says, listen, like you're wanting to understand, or you're discontent about this is fine, but the problem is the way you're phrasing it. It makes you sound wicked, like one of the wicked people, right? Because you're doubting God's justice, and you're not supposed to do that. He's impartial where humans are partial, and he sees where we do not see. And he really takes this idea of the cry against God that we see so much in maybe our own lives, but also in society and in media especially, and he says away with that, right? This is a lot of what chapter 35 is about. He's like, away, like I hear a lot of people say that, and he says this in 35, where he says, God, how could this is a paraphrase, God, how could you let this happen? But then it's like, where are they who rejoice and who thank God and who remind God that God is the one who gives us songs in the night and stuff like that? And I think that that's a really powerful way of combating this, is that so often we ask, why me? But we really don't ask, why not me, right? That's usually the push that Job and Elihu, well, the book of Job, and Elihu in it is giving, is he's saying, so a lot of this is just a humdrumming about how difficult life is, and yeah, that's part of it, but like, why not you, Job? Why not this thing? And of course, in Job's and his friends' mindset, justice is only like, things happen to you if you're bad, bad things happen if you're bad, and good things happen to good. And Elihu's challenging that. He's saying God has purposes beyond this, and that's a difficult thing. Right, that's a really difficult thing to grapple with, and I think a lot of people are dissatisfied with that. But as Elihu points out, people who are dissatisfied with that answer are a lot of the time, and I'm not saying all the time, but a lot of the time they have preconceptions about how God should work and should act in their lives, and when those aren't met, they get upset, right? So, for instance, if you want to see a counterpoint to this, right, you can take the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul suffered all sorts of brutalities, and according to church tradition, was beheaded, right, in Rome. And like, if we have this idea of like, well, I'm a faithful servant, or like God has to answer for all of these things. You don't see that in biblical characters, right? They're not really interested in that because they understand that these things that happen are within God's plan, and they understand their relationship and all the blessings that God has given them. And even if it might, and Paul talks about in one of his letters how he doesn't understand why, at first he did not understand why God gave him some sort of physical ailment, right? We don't know what it was, but a lot of people believe it had something to do with the eyes, that he had difficulty seeing and things like that, based on some of the stuff he said in his letters. And he asks God to take it away, and God doesn't, right? And you can't have when you think of people in the Bible, can you have a more faithful servant of God in the New Testament than Paul? He's like written the most of the New Testament, right? So it's like, and he didn't get that, but Paul isn't concerned, right? He's not saying, I went to Ephesus and I went to Corinth and I did all these things and I deserve my healing to be, my eyesight, let's just say, to be restored. No, right? He goes, okay, well, as God tells him, my strength is made manifest in weakness, right? Made perfect through weakness. So, when I'm weak, then I'm strong. That's how Paul interprets it, right? And he doesn't go through demanding things of God. And I think that's where Job is really challenging, because I think at the end of the day, a lot of us think we are owed things. But as Elihu says, God could take away all of our breath, and he would be exactly right to do so, because he's God. So, and he's not, right? It's not saying that's God is just this capricious guy who can take away anything and do whatever, right? No, he's merciful. That's what Elihu's big thing is that God is actually abundantly merciful in doing that for us. But we have to trust. If we can, it's easy for us to trust in his mercy. It's really difficult for us to trust in his justice. And that's probably, due to sin and our rebellion and things like that. But I think that's a good way to at least start thinking about it. And Elihu's going to build up on this next week and continuing weeks, and they're going to get to hear from the big man himself. So, yeah, good stuff. Thank you, everyone, for watching. I will see you guys tomorrow for our mailbag, and have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. Peace out.